All right. Hi, and welcome to a very unscheduled Flex Live. Usually, we're talking strategy and growth and what works and doesn't work for mission based organizations. But today, Kelsey and I are here and we're talking about the news surrounding Hayden Panettiere and Neutrogena. We've talked about it the last few days, and we kept coming back to the same thing that, in addition to the very real tragedy at the core of all of this, there is also a necessary conversation about trust and women's health, authenticity, and what happens when a brand gets a very human moment wrong.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a lot, and it's really fresh. It's a sad situation. We're not here to speculate. We haven't been speculating about her death, and that's not what we want to talk about today. But what we do want to talk about is everything that's resurfaced about her relationship with Neutrogena, the conversations that she's had or hasn't had with Neutrogena, and a lot of the kind of fallout now that Neutrogena is dealing with when she spoke very publicly about having postpartum depression and how Neutrogena responded once this became a bigger issue that they could no longer ignore. And there's a lot to
Yeah. And just before we kind of start to unpack it, for anyone that hasn't followed the full story, Hayden was associated as a brand ambassador with Neutrogena for years. They had a really successful, longstanding relationship. And earlier this year, aligning with the release of her memoir, she talked publicly about what happened to her with Neutrogena after she spoke openly about her postpartum depression back in 2015. And the headline said it all. She was struggling. She became an addict. She had issues with her family life. And after she was honest about things that so many women face, Neutrogena ended the relationship. They claimed that there was a morals clause in her contract that came into play due to that conversation, and they dropped her. And she felt really abandoned by a brand that she had stood by and felt that she had represented for a long time. So while this happened back in 2015, she actually told the story back in May of this year. And when she told the story and it went pretty viral, Neutrogena just acted like it didn't happen. They didn't respond at all.
Yeah. And I mean, realistically, this crisis is kind of coming to the forefront of the conversation right now. But this started realistically back in May. I mean, honestly, it kind of started back in 2015. This is a crisis that has been boiling for a decade.
Yeah, I mean, now that Hayden has tragically passed away, the clips of her conversation from back in 2015 have now gone viral. They're everywhere. And people are furious, and honestly, rightfully so. Women started finding old social media posts of Neutrogena's and flooding the comments, calls for boycotts. And Neutrogena waited several days to respond, and now they've responded several days after her death out of respect for her family. They said they waited, but they've committed money to women's health. And I think to your point, the crisis really started back in 2015. They had a major opportunity in May to come and speak out. But that doesn't even address the explanation for the last few days. And it doesn't answer the bigger question. Like, where was Neutrogena in May when she talked about how negatively this impacted her and her life? And people really started to question, why did they drop her in the first place?
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part the hardest part to reconcile. And I think it's the part also that feels the most disingenuous because this is a brand whose audience is predominantly women and whose brand loyalists are probably around the same age as Hayden, right? Like they're around similar ages to us. They're the ones who started using, we were talking about like the old Neutrogena scrubs. They're the ones who are like the diehards, but they were also the women who were probably experiencing postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression. They were the ones who were going through the same issues as Hayden. And so it's almost feels like it's a little bit too late. Why, if she was open about postpartum depression, why did that become an issue for a brand whose audience is dealing with that, right? Why did that trigger a morals clause?
Right. Like, I think I keep going back to that too, of they talk about values and morals, but
Mhm.
values only matter when it gets inconvenient, when you actually have to use them and leverage them. So it's easy to say, rah, rah, we support women, women power, and to put it on your website. but it's super hard to actually live those when it's a struggle or when there's a controversy or when it really matters. And I think like if you're choosing, we live in the age of influencers. And so like if you're choosing to have a real person connected to your brand and they're struggling and the situation is messy, that's when you step up as a, especially if you're a women's brand, right? Like you find out whether you're in it for real. I would also just caveat this with like having postpartum anxiety and depression is not a character flaw. It's not misconduct. It's not anti-moral. The side effects of the things, the ways people choose to cope with that are side effects of having significant postpartum issues. It's a health issue. And so if the response by a brand who claims to be there for women's health and well-being is you're struggling, well, you're a problem for our brand. Um,
100%.
that communicates something big. I don't know. It communicates something.
Well, I also think, and of course you said that, and I got so excited, and then I kind of lost my train of thought here, which is the beauty of doing these things live. But I think too, like you said, this is the age of influencers where you're only as good as like the people representing your brand. You're only as good as those faces of the brand who are bringing the women in. And like it's 2026, people don't want someone who is put on a pedestal and who has to be perfect. Women and consumers in general want brands who are putting out authentic, relatable people.
Yes.
And I mean, unfortunately, these postpartum issues and these mental health issues are still taboo. I feel like we're slowly getting away from that. But I mean, even like right now, everything with the Lindsay Clancy trial, it's still hush hush. We can't talk about these issues. It makes you a bad parent. But I think had Neutrogena kind of flipped it on its head and said, hey, you're being really open about this issue. We respect that. We want you to be open about that because we know that that's going to bring women into our brand. Like they had, I think, not even just from like a moral standpoint, they had an opportunity, but also from a business standpoint. I think they missed an opportunity back in 2015. And then again, back in May, now that the national conversation has changed, to really say, we don't, we don't want perfection. And this isn't a mark on you. This is something that is relatable to millions of women. And I mean, like I can speak to that. I've talked to you offline about this, but I had postpartum anxiety with both of my kids, and it's something that still, even when I had my first in 2019, it's something that was still, is this normal? Am I allowed to talk about this? Like, and that's, I'm someone who's very open about mental health and who's very open about
You are.
things that are challenging for me. And it's still like, I felt like it was still a moral failing and a failure of me as a parent until I started talking more about it. And then it's one of those things that once you start talking about, you realize, oh, so and so had this. And probably a lot of our parents had this and they just didn't talk about it. And so again, I think it's when you have an issue that is so relatable and is so human, it's just a missed opportunity to not talk about it. And then again, it's a missed opportunity to say, oh, we're just not going to comment on it. We're just going to pretend like that nothing happened.
To you, you're an amazing mom. And one of the things that I am so proud of is that when you had those feelings, you didn't just sit back, you asked for help.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Right.
think that when people say, I'm struggling, I need help, people should step up and recognize that that's brave. That's not embarrassing. That's not a negative mark on anyone or anything, any family or brand. It's an opportunity to be like, wow, that was really brave of you.
Right.
Thank you for stepping up and we're going to support you.
Right.
And for a brand like Neutrogena that literally spent decades telling women to trust them, trust us with your
Mm-hmm.
insecurities. Do you have skin issues? We're going to help you. Nobody looks perfect on the outside, and all of those things that they were saying, it made it feel like, so you just care about the outward appearance, not the
Yeah.
one behind the skin. You just care about the skin on the outside. And that's
Right.
kind of what it said. You can't ask people for trust and then get surprised when those people are like, wait, you're not showing up for me as a human being. I'm out. Um,
Well, and I think that's exactly right. Like they really just missed the mark on who their audience is. And we could probably take this in a couple of like
yeah,
different directions and have a whole conversation about kind of legacy brands versus now again in the age of social media, you're having more like consumer based brands and those more like niche kind of the smaller businesses. But I think a big piece to that is because those smaller brands really understand this is who our audience is and we're not afraid to put those women in our advertisements and lead with those images and like the stories of real women. Whereas I think, legacy brands have started to get more comfortable with that, but clearly we still have an example of a brand who is not comfortable. And again, is now making a comment that seems like they're not making that comment because they actually care. They're now making a comment because their crisis comms team said, oh gosh,
Yeah.
we missed the mark. We have to. And that, again, it's really easy for a consumer to see through that and say, you know what? I don't like that face wash enough to stick with you. I'm going to go find a new brand. Like, you've served me for 20 years, but like, hey, my skin's not loving it and I'm not loving it either.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. Like, imagine we go back to May and Hayden goes on Jay Shetty's podcast and tells her story. And Neutrogena was like, goodness, we were in the wrong. We're going to respond now. And they don't talk about legal briefs or contracts or moral clauses or whatever, else. They're human and they acknowledge what Hayden shared. And they said they're sorry that they were not there for her during an incredibly difficult time, a time that other women are experiencing, and then acknowledging
Right.
women's mental health. That's a different story today than what we're hearing. And potentially a different story for a lot of women who looked at them and
Yes.
said, yeah, I'm not using you anymore.
And I think that's like the biggest failure of the comms team at Neutrogena and the CEO, right? Because they didn't have 2 minutes to think about an answer. They sat on it again in 2015. They sat on an answer. Then in May, they chose not to respond. And then even now, I do understand, hey, there is a decision to be made. This is a sensitive topic. We do want to give some space. We don't want to make it exactly about us after this woman just tragically passed away. But you had time to think through like how you're going to respond, think through the way that you want to message this. And they still made the decision to just kind of say, oh, yeah, we made a mistake, but here's some money. And hopefully you ignore it. And so I think it's kind of a failure of like the crisis comms team. And then again, going back to your earlier conversation or your earlier point on the values, we say all the time, the values are how you show up when no one's looking.
Yes.
So we say that like about our own values at Flex and the way that we really believe them. And then when we work with our clients to, if we're taking them through like a strategic planning or something, or for our startups, when we're working with them to set their values, it's the values are great and everyone can carry out values when you have like the Wall Street Journal coming to write about your culture or you have an investor who wants to know why they should give money. But when no one's looking and you're just operating on a day-to-day, like that's when your values actually show up. So I think it's a failure of them to live out their values as well.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I like keep thinking when that happened back in 2015, obviously none of us were there. We weren't in the room. We don't know how it was presented, on either side. But there was also an opportunity if they were like, hey, we need to put the public stuff on pause for a minute. They
Mhm.
could have said, hey, Hayden, we're concerned. We heard you. How could we help you? Is there a way that we could support you and give you some breathing space and some time to, rebuild your mental health? Anything like that would have been better than what they did. Um, you and I tell clients all the time, and we have so many conversations about the fact that you don't have to respond to every criticism and you don't have to insert yourself into every conversation, but that isn't one of these situations. This was a woman who had represented their brand for years, that they had personally promoted, put millions of dollars behind, directly connected to them. And she's now telling in May of this year a personal story of how your brand, your organization treated her. Directly disconnects, it's directly in conflict with the way you portray yourself. You have to take a step back and evaluate it. That is your job as an organization, as a company, to figure out, okay, maybe the same people who were there in 2015 aren't there now, right? You got to look at what happened. What is true about the public story? What's not true? Who was affected? Is there somebody we need to call? That was a part of things back then, just to learn what was
Right.
going on. And then you need to say something and respond, because the risk of not responding in a case like this is far worse than the risk of actually addressing it head on. And now we see the outcome of that, right? Like, silence is a choice. It's not an obligation. And case by case basis, but sometimes silence is the choice that leads to a bigger crisis.
Yeah. I mean, in this situation, it's like their silence for all intents and purposes was the equivalent of saying no comment, right? And we finished a media training this morning, and we're always saying no comment is never an acceptable answer. And if your silence is perceived as you not having a comment, it's just as bad because now they're also in this position where they put out their statement, they're doing something that they're contributing to these causes. It's a positive thing, but even their positive response is now it's viewed with cynicism and it's viewed with, okay, what are your actual intentions here? Are you doing this because you care, or are you doing this because the internet was mad and you're worried that you're going to
Right.
lose your profit and your bottom line's going to suffer?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, like we can, I mean, I hope it's a meaningful response. I hope they
Hmm.
put their blood, sweat, tears behind it. At the end of the day, no one's perfect. No individual, employee, company, person is perfect. That's the whole point here. But organizations are allowed to learn and evolve, especially if they do it intentionally. So better late than never. But you know, my question would be, would they be doing this if the internet wasn't angry, if this tragedy hadn't happened and the internet hadn't said, "What is wrong with you?"
Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that, right? Like who knows if their comms team or if their leadership even knows the answer to that. Um, but yeah, they're in this situation where now everything that they say is going to be taken at face value or is going to be poked apart. And that's a tough position to be in. And I think they've also now they're in this conversation now about women's health. And that's a bigger conversation again now, especially Hayden's death, the Lindsay Clancy trial. On one hand, I'm glad that these things are being talked about in such an open forum because I think it is going to move the national conversation forward, hopefully move medicine forward to where we have, you know, you don't have a woman saying, I need help, and them saying, okay, just fill out this worksheet and we'll get back to you in 3 weeks, but really being taken seriously. Um, but again, hopefully also brands recognizing these are the issues that women are talking about and that women are concerned with, or consumers as a whole. And so instead of being afraid of those or saying that's a moral failing, we're going to embrace that and embrace this is what audiences need and want to see and support in 2026.
No, you're 100% right. Like we said earlier, it is brave to say there's something going on and I need help to figure out how to solve it, and I don't know the solution. And, you know, obviously the national conversation right now is all over the place, and there are so many tragedies that are coming up related to women's health, and I hope and pray that these things are not in a vacuum and they really do, like you said, drive medicine, women's health, the conversation to move forward. And honestly, there's been some pretty disgusting conversation about it online. You know, we're seeing women say, "Hey, this is real." We're seeing people come out and say this was wrong. We're also seeing people say, "Oh, this is overblown. This is not
Mm-hmm.
real. This is a scapegoat for other bad behavior, other issues." I think we all need to be willing to step up and call those people out and say, "No, it's not," and not call
100%.
people up. And you know, in the opposite of shutting some people down, why are we propping up the people who are saying really damaging things out in the public? And there's another piece of this, Kelsey, that you and I talked about a little bit earlier today. It's that Neutrogena came out in their statement and said directly that they made Hayden feel unsupported. And I think that's a really big difference there. And this is another thing I would call out when you're dealing with something like this. They're saying we made her feel unsupported, not taking the accountability and saying we
Yeah.
failed to support her. And that accountability piece is really important to say, hey, we were in this position and we made a bad choice. Because instead
Right.
of that, they made it about her. Once again, like deflected it to her instead of taking
Yeah.
it on themselves. And
Yeah.
brands should be accountable. Like everyone should
Right.
be. Like,
100%. I mean, that feels like my 6-year old saying to his 4-year-old sister, like, oh, I'm sorry I made you cry. Or, you know what I mean? Like a false apology, like, oh, sorry you cried because I hit you, right? Like, sorry you did this instead of really reflecting on what my actions are. And if I'm having to equate my 6-year old's behavior with a brand, like that's an issue. Don't
no,
act, don't, don't act like a 6-year-old. That's
you're,
like the baseline information.
you're not wrong at all. And I think we also, you mentioned the training we were doing earlier, we talked a lot about trust and authenticity.
Hmm.
And in the digital age where there's a lot of people, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of influencers, trust is currency. People are watching, they're listening, they're looking to see if you own things or if you're like finding the safest way out. You know, like like you said, we always tell kids, don't take the easy way out, do the tough stuff, deal with
Right.
it head on. Don't squish it under the rug. And I think this is a prime example of when that goes wrong.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what they did wrong. And don't act like a 6-year-old, don't do X, Y, or Z. But if you're a brand, you're watching this all unfold, what should you take away from it so that you don't make the same mistake?
It's a great question. So I think if like we were advising someone, and we were like, all right, Kelsey and I sat down and had a powwow, and this is, how we would either train you to avoid this from happening or guide the conversation around a response. It's that, like I said earlier, values matter the most when it's inconvenient to have to apply them. So if you're going to say, we support people, we value you, we love you for who you are, we believe in women and women's health, then you have to figure out what that looks like on both sides, especially when it gets difficult. Also, everybody who's ever worked with us is going to know what I'm saying, but know your audience beyond the demographic profile. You can have a list of statistics that say women age this and this that live in these places use our product. But behind those statistics are real live people with a lived experience, with empathy, with fear, going through all sorts of stuff. You got to know how your customer has changed as they've used your product. You got to know what they're going through at that phase of life and be willing to address it. And in this case, I think heavily like know what they expect from you now, not what they picked up at CVS or Walgreens 10 years ago when they first got introduced to you. God. And then last, I would say, don't wait for the
Yeah.
crisis to become a crisis. You hit this home earlier. Like, what if they had dealt with this early and head on? You don't
Hmm.
necessarily need like a big long public statement. It could just be like a phone call. Like if they called Hayden and said, "Hey, we
Yeah.
just did an interview, how can we help?" That could have been a completely different story all the way around here.
Well, and I don't even think that they had reached out to her, which that's again, someone is a brand representative. Your trust is your currency. And if you are saying vulnerable things and you're getting dropped and then you're never really hearing, and then 10 years later you're speaking about it, that is your duty as a brand to reach out. Because if not, yeah, your bottom line is gonna suffer.
Yeah. I mean, imagine though, like you've been extremely vulnerable in the most meaningful way possible, very brave and courageous to do that. And then you get dropped and basically ghosted, right? Like you
Yeah,
don't hear from them. What does that tell you about your value and then how you should approach vulnerability in the future? Um, that's just, it says a lot.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
absolutely. Okay, where should Neutrogena go now? What should
like,
they do now?
uh, good question. I don't know, Kelsey, like, I think you probably have a good answer here too, but I would say like, be real, follow through with what you said. If you're going to promote women's health, promote it. Issue a real apology.
Yeah,
Like do that. Don't issue a statement now and then be like, okay, well, we checked the box. We're going to disappear.
100%.
Pull together a panel of women who know the issue, who are experiencing it, who have experienced it. Some professionals have real conversations with women who have lived it and be a part of those that are pushing the needle forward for real solutions and addressing it from a medical and a legal perspective. And then, if you and I are having this conversation a year from now, maybe we're able to be like, wow, Neutrogena has really played a major role in advancing
Right.
women's health in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is a year from now, I hope that they prove me wrong, right? Like I'm sitting here saying, yeah, it feels a little bit forced. I'm a little bit cynical that they're actually going to follow through with all of this. I hope I'm proven wrong. And so if I'm Neutrogena, I'm being really open about the fact that, hey, a sentence can't fix this, right? We messed up and we're owning that. And here's what we're going to do. Not in a performative way, but in a way that, to your earlier point, takes true accountability for a mistake and moves the ball forward. Because a sentence isn't going to fix this.
Right. You've said this to clients before. You can't statement your way back into
Yeah.
trust. You behave your way, you do it through actions. Again, things we tell our kids, right? Like actions speak
Hmm.
louder than words. You can't statement your way back into the good graces of your audience and of the public at large. And I think that's probably where we leave this episode of Flex
Yeah.
Life. Want to reiterate that Hayden's story is tragic and there is a lot that we don't know and we don't want to speculate about those things. We just want to acknowledge the tragedy, and we wanted to talk about what she chose to talk about while she was here. She talked openly about postpartum depression, about struggling, about feeling abandoned, and that she's not alone in that. She was alone, but she was not alone in those feelings. And the lesson for all of us as leaders, as people, is not respond faster, don't avoid people getting angry. It's be human, know the people you're serving, listen when someone tells you they're hurt. And then authenticity isn't a marketing strategy. It's how you treat people and how you show up every day.
100%. Yeah, couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kelsey, for
Thank
sharing
you.
this and for being so vulnerable and personal yourself during our conversation. To anyone watching, we would love to hear what you think, not just about Neutrogena, but what responsibility brands and organizations have to the people who represent them, and honestly to the audiences that they've spent years cultivating and asking to trust them. So thank you again, and we will see you next time on Flex Live.
Thank you, Whitney.